What is probably most remarkable about the Turkish experience, at least in the most recent years, is although there is a rather, well, you know, a fairly distinct, motivated concern to deal with the Kurdish issue, is that at the same time, Turkey has undergone an opening up towards Europe in the last couple of years. So in Turkey, there is, let's say, a certain tendency to try and move away from a more, you know, what would be otherwise considered a more repressive approach towards one where democracy, human rights, and so on are more taken into account. Like I said, to open up more towards Europe. Whether that is also perceived that way is, of course, a matter that is still open right now. The Arab states, I think, are very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, of course, we talk mostly these days, when we talk about global or international terrorism, we often talk about jihadist terrorism. The issue is that probably no countries have been more victimized by jihadist terrorism than Arab states. There's a lot of, you know, if you look at the list of assassinations, bombings, and so on. So within the context of Arab states, this kind of motivated terrorism is clearly a very big domestic concern. And indeed, since the late 1990s, the Arab states, in the form of the Convention on Suppression of Terrorism reached by the Arab League, has made distinct efforts to deal with terrorism. In that sense, cooperation, all our conditions being equal, it's quite possible between police institutions from Europe, from the United States, and the Arab world. One factor that is probably more troublesome is the rather ruthless manner in which terrorism can be approached because of the relative lack of democratization of those societies. Now, we know that sometimes that is problematic. We also know that let's say, for broadly defined Western institutions, we also know that sometimes that provides opportunities. Because, of course, then Arab police institutions can be involved, can be, let's say, hired as a junior partner, so to speak, to deal with terrorism in a manner in which Western institutions will be constitutionally restrained. And we know there are such discussions about these kind of possibilities. Finally, in terms of that level of repressiveness, it provides a link to the situation in Russia. Again, we have distinctly domestic concerns. In that sense also, when I say that the events of 9/11 were a catalyst for counterterrorism policing, that does not necessarily mean that police in various nations will turn to jihadist terrorism. Instead, it may mean that police in certain nations will say, see, terrorism is a global problem. Well, guess what? We have our own terrorists. See? So that is 9/11, the issue of terrorism will be very broadly used and then will be defined more specifically within a domestic context. And so in Russia, it's particularly the Chechen conflict and the incidents in Moscow and Beslan that have provided, let's say, the concrete grounds within a domestic context to treat terrorism, to join the war on terror, right? To join this global war on terror, but then in a domestic issue. What is specific to Russia is, let's say, is that there is still a certain ghost of the Soviet Union, so to speak, right? So you've inherited this system that is highly centralized, highly militaristic, and that, of course, can now be used against these issues of terrorism that are indeed very much defined in terms of national security issues, and then probably, and that much more easily, let's say, than in the context of democratic societies that are very much committed to constitutional restraints that can be, where the police function can be much more incorporated within this centralized militaristic approach. And so in that sense, let's say, the rather ruthless manner, and actually you probably know about the Beslan and Moscow incidents, in a few days later, 3 days later, they move in, kill everybody, that's kind of the way it is. So it's this very, very resolute approach that, in countries like the United States or in Europe would meet with a lot of concerns. Good. So that was just, very broadly, very briefly, some of the characteristics. Let's look at some of the issues that we have here. First of all, like I said, terrorism is like this global problem but it's a global problem that is kind of generically defined, generically described as a threat to the social order, and that precisely, I read a paper once by somebody, I forgot who, said it's a problem that terrorism and other issues are described so vaguely. It's not a problem at all, it's an opportunity, because what it allows you to do is to define it in more specific terms and to apply it within a domestic context. So you have these nationally variable circumstances that will allow you to frame the terrorism issue in a more specific form. What is very important, of course, is there are important political and legal differences. I talk a lot about that in terms of the degree of democratization of society, in terms of the degree of centralization. Sometimes these situations are very ironic, of course, because centralization can just be an historical residue. Belgium has a highly centralized and indeed militaristic police. The demilitarization of the Belgian police is an issue they've been talking about since the 1990s, because historically Belgium has inherited a system of policing from Napoleon. Okay, so it's a direct heir to the Napoleonic system. You have the same, for instance, in Russia. So sometimes these, let's say, these constraints are not political in terms of the moment, but are historically defined. And it obviously affects the extent to which police institutions can act autonomously. We have difference, which I already said, between intelligence and law enforcement, how that is organized. For instance, I wrote about that in a separate paper on Europol. Within Europe, within the European Union, terrorism is in some nations primarily the responsibility of intelligence, and in others primarily the responsibility of policing. So you have, because as soon as you work cross-border, you also work cross-functionally, across agencies, which presents problems. So you see, what I argue then for is that there are these variable conditions that will affect, as here I put it in the words of Max Weber, that will affect the possibility to which the police can act, quote unquote, as the representative of God on earth. Weber made this kind of joking comment in the context indeed of a society that is accustomed to pacification. So he said, it's in a society that has achieved the modicum of peace, there the policeman can become the representative of God on earth. Conversely, a society that is at war, and obviously in that context I talk about Iraq and Afghanistan, and we know that the normalization of the police function is much more problematic. Finally, to round it off, what we see is that September 11th has functioned indeed as a global catalyst for counterterrorism, first of all in terms of the legal and the political response, but also in terms of the police response. And like I said, it is defined invariably within nations. However, what is true is that, definitely true, is that irrespective of any existing differences between police institutions of different nations, the manner in which they approach policing, and so on, is that there is definitely 9/11 has also served as a direct catalyst for international police cooperation. And that is just unequivocally the case. Now, that obviously presents problems in terms of some forms of cooperation, the extent to which you can cooperate, the extent to which, perhaps, like I mentioned the example before, you can rely on your partners to engage in efforts that within your own nation would be constitutionally constrained, and so on. So, well, that's about it for today. I just want you to know, or want to alert you to the fact that my book, because it is advertising time right now, right? But that my book is being printed as we speak, and this is the cover. So, and it's going to be out, I think, within 3 weeks. So it's called The Policing of Terrorism. I didn't make it too complicated, the title, and so that's going to be out soon. If you want to look at some of my other articles, which I mentioned here, I also have a website, so you can look, just look at my website. My articles are available online, because I assume that putting articles online is just a minor copyright infringement. Putting a book online would be too much of a violation, so I won't do that. So just a few more weeks, and then you can